Our first reading this morning is from Psalm 27, verses 1 through 9. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to devour my flesh, my adversaries and foes, they shall stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise up against me, yet I will be confident. One thing I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. Now my head is lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger, you who have been my help. Do not cast me off. Do not forsake me, O God of my salvation.
So I introduced the Corinthians a little bit with the kids, but I do think that that's really a key thing for us to know. Thank God for the Corinthians and all the trouble that they got in, to help us to know that all the trouble we get in is not the end of everything, but just part of what it is to struggle with human nature and trying to be the children of God in a fallen world. So let's listen now to Paul's words to the Corinthians, who were divided in so many ways and at so many times, and hear what Paul has to say. Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that none can say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the house of Stephanas. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anybody else. For Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its power. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. This is the word of God to you. So I just want to really briefly go over the entire history of Christianity and the development of denominations. We're going to try to keep a short sermon. So we start with Jesus, right? And at the time of Jesus, there was one faith and we were all united, except, of course, that Judas didn't really agree with how things were going on. But, early on, you've got the church, and then the church, as soon as Jesus dies and is resurrected, pretty quickly afterwards, they have a division. They have the sort of Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians, and they sort that out. But then there are more divisions that start to happen. You get the Gnostic Christians that come this way. You get the Monophysite Christians that tend to be sort of towards the east. You get the Arians and the Donatists and all of these other groups. And they all kind of divide up, right, into a little set of subsects of the one Christianity. And then they start to divide even more. You get the sort of split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. That happens around 1100. So maybe I've skipped a few centuries. You get the split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. You have the Eastern Orthodox Church that are the sort of patriarchies of the 6 other churches, and then the Western Church, which is the Patriarchy of Rome. And then we have a few more years of somewhat stability. There's the Pelagian controversy. There's a bunch of controversies and some minor schisms in there, but then you get to the Reformation, right? And that's when it gets good. Because in the Reformation, everybody gets a church. Luther's people get a church. We call those the Lutherans. They're based in Germany. Calvin's people get a church. They were primarily based in Switzerland, and we call them Presbyterians. The Anabaptists have all of these different traditions, the Quakers, the Mennonites, the Baptists. Then, of course, the English, they want to get in there, so there's another split there. They get their own Reformation. And the English split into various national churches. You got the Church of Scotland, you got the Church of England. I really don't know what happened to Wales. And so at this point, we've got, all these different denominations, and then people start to go to America. And when folks start to go to America, one, we don't want to forget that there are still all sorts of church splits going on in other places, right? At some point in this mess, the Ethiopic church sort of splits off down here. You have churches in Indonesia that don't have any connection to other churches, or other sort of parts of the Christian world. So then we come over to America, and the Methodists split off from the Episcopalians or the Anglicans. And then the Presbyterian Church is founded. And we have a blissful existence of maybe a year before we start to split into different churches. You have this sort of northern-southern church split. You have the Cumberland split. You have the Orthodox Presbyterian Church split. You have the EPC split. There is, I think, the Bible Presbyterian Church. So we got all these different splits. And right about here, you get the PCUSA. And thank goodness we finally got it right. The one true church right here. All the rest of them, we forget about, right? We laugh because that's not really how it is, right? We're all trying to do it the way that we need to, but we've ended up with all of these different splits, with all these different churches that don't know how to be together, even though we claim, at the very least, to have one Lord and to be one body. And the people we need to talk about to figure out how to navigate this is football coaches. Let me tell you what I mean. I'm a Tennessee fan. I grew up in Tennessee. My parents went to Tennessee. We've always rooted for Tennessee. And in the last 12 years, we've had 5 head coaches. And that's bad in the football program, because what you need is stability. In order to be a good program, you've got to keep the same people in place. If your coach is always turning over, the recruits won't stay. If you don't have good players, you can't have good teams. In the basketball side, in that same period of time, we had 4 coaches. In women's basketball, where we once had Pat Summitt for 38 years, we've had 3 coaches in the last 12 years. All of this instability, you would think, would turn into recruiting problems. But the truth is that all of those teams have recruited pretty much at the same level. And the reason for that is that the coaches all know the secret. You don't recruit to the coach, you recruit to the program, right? When you ask your people to come and play football, you ask them to come play football for the University of Tennessee, not Coach Jeremy Pruitt or Butch Jones or Derek Dooley or Lane Kiffin or Phil Fulmer, all of which have been coaches in the last few years. Now, I recognize that sports metaphors are not the only metaphors that people need to hear, so maybe we can talk about it this way. I know we've had a lot of teachers, right? Any teacher who has applied to a new job has probably had an administration that promised them things. A principal that said, here's how it's going to be. But of course, if you are going to have a 30-year career, you know how long an administration can last. And so if you're going to take a job in a place, you take that job not because you love the administrator, not because you love the principal, you take that job because you love the school, right? You got to go to the program and not the leader of the program. In the same way, we are in the midst of primary season. Isn't that fun? I'm done. I'm just completely done. I don't want to hear a single politician again as long as I live. And the thing that we get all the time is these little tidbits that are supposed to make the candidates relatable, right? But you don't vote for somebody because they don't put ketchup on their hot dogs. You vote for somebody because you think that their work will further the common good. It's about the program. It's not about the person. The basic principle is that if your connection to an organization or an institution or a movement is about the person or the loyalty to one person, and not about the loyalty to the work of the movement, the goals of the place, the program of the place, then your commitment is thin indeed. And this is exactly what the Corinthians were getting wrong. Paul had founded the church in Corinth. And then, he was an itinerant preacher. He was a church planter. He planted a church. He moved on to the next place. And so he was gone off to the next place. And of course, it's a church, and other people are touring around. There's Apollos, who's known as an excellent preacher, a friend of Paul's. And he spent some time in Corinth. It says Cephas. Cephas is the Aramaic term for rock. And so the Greek term for that is Peter. So when you see Cephas, which comes up in some of Paul's writings, and when it comes up in Acts, usually we assume that they're referring to Peter and not some other person we haven't heard of named Cephas. It's Peter. So Peter was there in the Corinthian church. And all of a sudden, there are all these people in Corinth who have lost sight of the big picture and are committed to their particular group. There's some folks who are Apollos people. We are Apollos Christians. There's some folks who are Peter Christians. We're Peter people. We do what Peter says, and if you don't agree with Peter, then I don't agree with you. And we've got people that say we're Paul people. And we agree with Paul. And if you don't agree with Paul, then we don't agree with you. And then, whenever this happens, there's some group that figures out you can shortcut this and you can just claim the whole thing for yourselves. And they say, oh, well, we're Christ people. You guys are not, but we are. The sort of history of Christianity is littered with denominations that declared themselves the Christian church. My battery ran out, so I have to talk a little bit louder. The history of Christianity is littered with denominations that decided that they were the only denomination that could exist. They called themselves the Christian church, right? But of course, that's not what we're called to do. And so here is what Paul says to these people. He says, has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? What Paul is saying is that the hope and the purpose of all this work has not been to create loyalty to Paul, but to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ as well as he is able. And I think this is a really clutch note that he adds to it. And not eloquently. I need that as a preacher. Paul says it's important that he not proclaim it eloquently, because if he does, we might be loyal to the sort of flourishes of beautiful and meaningful language, and not to the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is plain. It doesn't need all of this flourishing that might distract us from the reality of the truth, which is that Christ died for us. Christ loved us so much that Christ suffered with us. Christ loved us so much that that love went beyond death and invites us into eternal life, salvation, and redemption. It runs counter to every other notion of how we can thrive in the world. We're supposed to, we're supposed to thrive in the world by stepping on people, by getting ahead, pushing somebody else out of the way. But Christ tells us that we are called to serve other people. We're called to let other people go first and make ourselves last. And this promise is what Paul calls foolishness to those who are perishing, but for us, it is our salvation. The proclamation of the gospel is that Christ gives us his holiness and lifts us up to new life, to proclaim the good news of Christ's salvation to everyone. Paul wants it to be very clear. He does not want the Corinthians to be his people. He wants them to be Christ's people. And our hope today is the exact same. We want you to be Christ's people. The hope and the aim of this church, and the hope and the aim of every church, I think, is not for you to become a member or for you to become a giver. It's not for you to have a relationship with the church. It's not for you to have a relationship with the pastor of the church or with people in the church. The goal and aim of the church is for you to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. We want you to be Christ's people.
All of these other things, they are important to the church, but they're not the end of the church. Your relationship with your pastor, with your church community, with the choir, with your Sunday school teachers, all of these things serve a purpose. And that purpose is to deepen your relationship with Jesus Christ. That's not to say that these other relationships are bad. They're not. We depend on each other. Our mission statement says we take care of each other. That's part of the work of Christ. It's learning to see Christ in each other and be Christ for each other. You might get involved in a church because of a particular group of people. Maybe there's somebody really important to you who's a member of the church. Maybe you get really connected to your Bible study, your Presbyterian women's group, the one person that sits behind you in the pews and always checks in about your week. But ultimately, these relationships are supposed to bring you into deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. The relationship that is above and beyond all of these other relationships that we have with each other. What we want is for you to be Christ's people. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to agree all the time on everything. Paul urges unity, not uniformity. Paul isn't asking people to agree with him. In fact, he's yelling at the very people who do agree with him. He's criticizing them for showing loyalty to him instead of loyalty to Christ. The church truly is dependent on difference. We need difference of opinion, we need difference of perspective, difference of personality, talent, skill, and culture, because all of these differences illumine the whole light of the gospel, and not just what's easy for us to see. When we become children of God, when we root our identity in our baptism in Christ, we don't lose our other identities. We don't lose our ethnic heritage, our family identity, our cultural identity, our social or class or gender identity. But all of those identities become subservient to our identity as Christ followers. And those identities can no longer serve as things that we use to dominate one another or to declare that we are better or more or stronger than one another. And it doesn't mean that we're supposed to ignore important things in the case of peace. That's the negative piece that we talked about before, right? Which is the absence of conflict. But we're called to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Paul wants us, in all our differences and diversity, to come together around one shared identity, the identity of children of God, followers of Jesus Christ. Now, there are times when this is particularly crucial for us. One of these times is when there are transitions in pastoral leadership in a church, or any time that we're tempted to sort of break out into sides, right? And it's good to talk about this when we're not breaking out into sides, when we're not having changes in leadership, because if we start talking about when we do have changes in leadership, there are always sides, and it always feels like criticism of one side or support for another side. If we do it in the midst of conflict, it's hard. That's why we've got to talk about it all the time. But when we break up into divisions within the church, into sides within the church, we lose perspective on where our identity should be rooted. Are we traditionalist people, or are we reformist people? Do we want to keep the church as it is, or do we want to make the church different? Do we want to be 11 o'clock service people or 9:30 service people, even though they have different worship styles? Which side are we on? Everybody who's navigated a pastoral transition has probably been through this at some point. Or everybody who's navigated a conflict in the church has been through this. And we've got to talk about it when we're not in it, so we're ready for the inevitable. The breakdown into sides is not necessary. When I talk to married couples or couples who want to get married, I try to frame it this way. I say, if you see disagreements in your marriage as conflicts between the two of you, you're going to have a tough time, right? Because you're pointed at each other. When you have a disagreement and you say, well, you're wrong and I'm right, and you're wrong and I'm right, and you can't get anywhere there, right? So what we want to do in our marriages and our relationships is to say, we are a partnership. And the problem is outside the partnership. It's not that I need to get you to change or you need to get me to change. It's that we need to figure out how we can work together so that we can deal with the problem. It's not me against you, it's us against the problem. And that's the same thing that goes when we are in the church together, right? The goal is for all of us to be oriented in the same direction, and that direction is Jesus Christ. It is solving our problems together, trusting each other, but ultimately humbly serving as followers of Christ. The other time that I think is particularly crucial, and that we need to be attentive to, and especially attentive to now, is when our youth go off to school. When you grow up in a church, especially when you grow up in a church that is loving and caring and kind, your relationship with Christ is almost always mediated through the people that you know who taught you about Christ, right? When you think of what it is to be the church, you think of your church. When you think of what it is to be Christian, you think of the Christians that you know. You think of the culture that the church has as a Christian culture. You think of the worship that the church has as Christian worship. So going to a new church is really hard because everything is different. All of the people are different. And the culture and the worship style are different. Even in churches that are very, very similar, the culture and the worship style are very different. And so it can be really easy to say, I'm gonna wait until I find a church that feels right, a church that feels exactly like the church that I grew up in. So it's crucial that we develop in our kids a relationship not just with the church, not just with the people of the church, but a relationship with Christ. So that when they go out into a new place, they're not completely unanchored, they're not completely lost from their identity in Christ. They know that here is another manifestation of Christ. Here is another gathering of Christ followers, but I am here to be in relationship with Christ. And so, as well as we can, we need to strengthen our kids, and in particular, their relationship with Jesus, not just their relationship with us, so that when they go off into a new place, they are depending on Jesus. They are looking for a place where they can encounter the living Christ, not where they can encounter the same people or the same feeling that they once had before. And of course, maybe that's something that's true not just for our youth, but for our adults as well. Whether or not our kids have a relationship with Christ will determine how far and how well they're able to transition into a new worshiping community in their adult life. We're not just working to build a community together. We're working to build a community of Christ followers. So the ultimate goal of this place isn't perfect unity, isn't growth in membership or giving, but it is the same goal that Paul had. It is the proclamation of the gospel that seems foolish, but in which all of us have found peace, grace, and the opportunity for new life and a new world that doesn't operate by the old rules. We don't want you to have a relationship with the church. We don't want you to have a relationship with the pastor of the church. We don't want you to have a relationship with the people of the church. We want you to have a relationship with Christ. We are here to be Christ's people. In all of our diversity, in all of our difference, in all of our hope. Putting everything together so that we can go from this place knowing that Christ walks with us, serving faithfully, and trusting that in all things Christ has conquered and will conquer, and is reconciling all things to himself. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.